The topic, in shorthand, is Pharaoh and the truth, or how you make your point. How do you get across to someone to change their opinion? It's interesting looking at how people make decisions and then how people can be open to changing their mind. How do you get across to them? It's interesting in the added class today. The topic came up of faith because of the famous line that was ascribed to St. Augustine, credo que absurdum est. I believe because it is absurd. And what occurs is the idea that is believed because it's irrational, or because it's beyond irrational. The fact is that when you get someone believing in something because it's irrational, what occurs if someone starts believing it because of this term faith? And faith is like beyond reason, or whatever these things terms, but it basically means that faith becomes a yardstick of accepting something that can't be challenged. I mean, if you really think about it, when you challenge someone, you really challenge someone through reason, through basically saying, listen, you think this is what's happening? Well, I'm going to show you I'm going to show you an opposing fact, an opposing conclusion. And then you sit there and say, gee, I got a problem with accepting a thought. When light bent around the sun, that wasn't supposed to happen pursuant to Newtonian physics. They had a problem because reason was the bottom line. They can't just say, well, this is the truth. Say, okay, how does this work? And therefore, the challenge put in terms of reason says, I have to rethink my theory, my logic. With the statement of credo que absurdum est, what happens is that I believe because it's so absurd or whatever, but what happens is that really supports the concept of faith. Talk about the leap of faith and so forth. And it becomes that the only way you know you're right is because you say you're right. This is the truth. And there's no challenge possible to that perspective. And that really is why certain systems talk about faith. Because faith can't be challenged. If you show something happening that's contrary to what you think would happen, well, you got it wrong. You didn't understand it. Or basically it comes to a point where you can sit there and say, I don't have all the answers. It's beyond my knowledge, but I still believe. And that's the way many people think in the realm of religion. It's the way many people think in terms of, maybe not that extreme, but it's the way that many people think in terms of their decision making. They become so locked into their perspective that you can no longer have an argument with them, because they're not open to debate. They're not open to challenge. And there's a little bit of something like that in all of us. When we have ideas, we become locked into them. Let's go back to the Newton idea. Einstein said, when he challenged the whole concept of Newtonian physics and came up with the theory of relativity, he said that the general theory of relativity wasn't that mind-blowing. Many people could have come up to it beforehand. But they were so locked into Newtonian concepts that they could not think differently. They were locked in. So therefore, there comes a certain point in time where you sit there and say, I'm going to start thinking a little bit differently. I'm going to challenge what I think are givens. And that is very hard to do because we rely upon the givens for how we look at life. Okay? So, this issue is very much part of the Pesach story. Because Pesach is not just about the freedom of the Jews. When exactly did the Jews stop working as slaves? Do you know when? Were they actually free from their slavery? They no longer were enslaved. Anyone know?
When they left Egypt.
No. I mean, everyone thinks freedom came like with that. But when would they actually stop working? According to the Medrash, when did they actually stop working?
Okay, I don't know. I cannot quote the Medrash, but I believe that they stopped thinking like slaves after one generation in the Sinai. In other words,
that's post facto, and the fact is that there's an issue of whether they still had the slave thought and so forth, and that's
right.
The issue with the first generation. But I'm asking a different question. When were they actually not enslaved in Egypt? In other words, slavery consists of not just when they left Egypt. When did they no longer have to do the work for the pharaohs, or for the Egyptians? So there's a medrash like this. They were no longer enslaved in the previous Rosh Hashanah. That's 6 months earlier. They couldn't leave Egypt, but they were no longer enslaved. Okay? They couldn't leave Egypt, but the fact of the matter is they weren't working for the Egyptians anymore. Basically, their time was their own. Okay?
How come?
So that's the question. So what's the point like that? So what really was the point of the Makot? When you really think about this, God wanted the Jews to leave Egypt. There was a simple way they could have done it. Moshe could have went over. I mean, the whole thing that's going on over there, let my people go, right? Moshe going to Pharaoh and saying, you have to let my people go. We need your permission to leave. Why didn't Moshe just go over to Pharaoh and say, hi, we're leaving tomorrow morning, okay? Been nice knowing you. Goodbye. What would Pharaoh have done? Would he, okay, he may have tried something, but if God was going to do all these miracles for them, then basically he just, could have walked out, and if Pharaoh's army started shooting bows and arrows, then you could have simply, had them boomerang back to the Egyptians. Right? God could have done that, right? So what's the whole drama about? And the Jews weren't enslaved. What's the whole drama about? What's the whole point of the Makot, of the plagues? Okay? It was to teach the Egyptians and the Jews, reinforce it for the Jews, but basically get across the point to the Egyptians that God is God. It was the destruction of the Egyptian religion. It was the destruction of the religion of the Egyptian falsehood. Do you all remember in the Ten Commandments? Yul Brynner, the scene that I constantly refer to, comes back from the Red Sea, and what does he do? He drops into his chair, right? Yeah. Drops into his chair, and what's her name? Who's not part of the story, anyways, but not part of the truth. She says, "What are you doing?" And what does Yul Brynner do? He is God, right? The fact is that actually is from the Medrash. Okay? It's the Medrash. The Medrash says, if you look closely at the language about at the sea, Pharaoh didn't die at the sea. It says all these just chariots and so forth and so forth. What happened was, supposedly, and if you look at the credits in terms of the Ten Commandments of the movie, one of the credits is the Jewish Medrash. And what happened is that Pharaoh went to the edge of the sea and said, "Go get them, go get them, go get them." But he didn't go into the sea. And when the sea came crashing down and everything was destroyed, right? What did Pharaoh do? Pharaoh basically said, "Okay, now I get the message." That's what the Medrash says. He is God. That's why there's another Medrash.
But I thought that was the whole point.
The whole point was?
Of the whole story.
What was the whole point?
Was for him to realize that the Jewish people's God is God, is who they are.
So it's not to free the Jews. That's exactly it. The whole case with the plagues and something like that, it was to get across the truth. And that was a difficult argument. When did finally Pharaoh get that argument? Only after the Red Sea. Right? After the plague of the firstborn, he said, well, maybe we'll go after them anyways, Okay? And then finally at the Red Sea, he finally says, he is God. I was totally, totally wrong. There's another interesting medrash.
Unless you're going to come back to it. So go back to why on Rosh Hashanah, how were they suddenly...
Because on Rosh Hashanah, when Moshe started the process, okay, the first plague happened 6 months before the whole thing. Each plague took time.
Right.
Okay? So this
it was my understanding, actually, that the story really takes place over a very long time, not just 6 months.
Actually, it took over 6 months. The story of the plagues was over something like 6 months, and that once the process started, then God says, "I have a point, I have an objective to get across the truth of my existence."
So it only took the first plague to get them to be free.
No,
but the rest
right,
to get
because the first plague, basically, in order to free someone in the land, what do you have to do? I mean, what does it mean? It means the Jews didn't show up to work, and the Egyptians didn't go about enforcing the slavery, right? Once God started the plagues, that was the situation. He wasn't going to allow the Egyptians to enforce the slavery on the Jews, and the Jews didn't show up for work. Okay? There's the whole process. Now, the fact is, the Egyptians, maybe they were already wondering, the blood and so forth, but they had serfs of their own now. They weren't worried so much about their slaves, especially as the plagues continued. And they already had a little bit concerned, see what's happening. But the fact is, once the plague started, the Jews no longer worked. Now, the argument is presented in Medrash because God said, I have an objective to get across the truth of me, get across of God's existence, but it's unfair for the Jews to keep working while I'm trying to make my point. So the slavery ended.
So then why in the story that we recite at Pesach, after each plague, we're still saying, let my people go?
So what does let my people go for?
Yeah.
So what does that mean? Like I just told you. And think about this. Let my people go. Okay? Why does Moshe need Pharaoh to say, let my people go? So long, it's been nice to know you. We're leaving. And in the end, how did they leave? How did they finally get out of, free themselves of the Egyptians? So Pharaoh said, yeah, you can go and you can go out and you can leave Egypt and so forth and so forth. And then Pharaoh said, well, I really only gave them permission for 3 days and now they're not coming back, so we're going to go after them. right? But at the Red Sea, they crossed the Red Sea. How did they actually leave when Pharaoh sends all the chariots into the sea? Does he have? Is it let my people go? It's Moshe basically saying, we're leaving. And the fact of the matter is, in the end, one of the big ways that Pharaoh finally gets a slap across his face and say, I didn't really need your permission. I really didn't need you to say, I really didn't need all that, let my people go. That was just to be nice in a facade. But in the end, we're leaving, whether you like it or not. And that's the way we finally left Egypt. We didn't leave with let my people go. Okay? Let my people go maintained a certain facade. Because really, why did you need Pharaoh's permission? And why did Moshe make it seem that you need Pharaoh's permission? Some interesting things going on over here between the lines. Yeah, it makes a great story, but what's really going on over here? And the fact is that you really understand that what's really going on is how you challenge someone's preconceived notions. Pharaoh had a whole way of understanding reality, understanding life. How do you get someone to finally open up their eyes and say, boy, the way I've been thinking is totally wrong? And that's really what the plagues were about. But the fact that it took time and so forth really tells you about the way people think. I just started off with that story about faith because the fact is in so many ways, one of the ways that people try to establish commitment is through simplistic faith, and credo quid absurdum est is that, and it's beyond logic. And it sounds like faith is beyond reason. Yeah, because if it's beyond reason, you can never challenge it. Right? Because there's no way I can get into a dialogue with you, or a discussion with you, or a debate with you. If you're going to come up to me and say, 1 + 1 = 3, okay, and I say, well, really it doesn't, so no, that's going to be our starting point, 1 + 1 = 3. I can't do math with you. It's very interesting because I've been told this by people who have arguments, let's say, with Jews for Jesus or things of that nature. On the surface, the arguments usually start over the verses, right? This verse, that verse, everyone's verse, and so forth and so forth. So you have a verse, and so the what happens is the missionary will go up to someone who's never heard this verse before and say, this is the verse, and on the surface it seems like this verse means this, and they say this is what it means, and so forth. The person's a little bit thrown off. Okay, so it's a pretty good argument, they think, and so forth. Then they go speak to an anti-missionary, someone who says, well, listen, you really don't know the verses. You should look at the verse in context, and you should actually see the greater perspective of the verse. You find out, well, verse can be understood differently. It could mean many, many other things. It may not necessarily mean this. So therefore you have a challenge and say, wait a second. That's not necessarily what the verse means. Okay? So then you go back to the missionary and say, why did you say the verse meant that? Oh, because this is the right interpretation. Yeah, but why don't you have a debate and discussion? And then you see that at worst, that that the verse can be understood both ways, with a little bit of in other words, the verse doesn't prove its point. Yeah, if you read it that way, you want to read it that way, you can stand that way. But then what it comes down to is, this is the right way of reading the verse, because this is the belief. And then when you really get into it, I've been told this by people who have been involved with missionaries, what they'll sit there and say, come on, it's not really about the verse. You really know the truth. you really know what the truth is. And the ultimate argument is you really know the truth. The reason that Christianity can say that you're going to hell if you don't have faith is brought up. I never heard this. Why is a person going to hell if they don't have faith? Because they really know the truth. They really have faith. They're just denying it. They really, really know the truth. And ultimately that's the argument. Come on, you really know what the truth is. You're just fighting it. Come on, clear your head. You really know the truth. Because that's what faith is. Faith basically says it's beyond reason, or it's nothing to do with reason. It's that you already know the truth. So if you get enough people saying, I know the truth, and you get them buying it, then there's no way you can challenge them. That's why for religious fanatics, they're really dangerous. Because you can't, there's no way you can have a discussion with them. Because they're fully committed to the belief in whatever they believe. So how do you make your point? So the fact is Pharaoh was a very religious man. Egyptian religion was very dominant in Egyptian society. Slavery was considered to be very dominant in Egyptian society. And people individuals see this in many different ways. We can interpret anything the way we want to. Slavery in the South, right? Okay, those who supported slavery used the Bible in support of slavery. Those who were against slavery used the Bible to attack slavery. Am I right? No. Did you actually analyze it? No. I'm looking to defend my viewpoint. Fact is human beings have very strong viewpoints. What happens with Pharaoh is a very powerful statement. Now, and that really becomes something very powerful in understanding dialogue and debate. Moshe was setting Pharaoh up. I wanted to mention to you also that, there's another medrash that's very interesting. Yonah, this is years later, and this is an interesting medrash, and we're not going to get into the details of the medrash in terms of facts or things of that nature. But there's another medrash that says when Yonah came to Nineveh, right, the city of Nineveh, to say you need to do tshuva, what happened? Jonah, this we read on Yom Kippur, right? That Jonah came to them, and the king of Nineveh said, well, we sinned against God, we better take care of this, right? A very immediate reaction. But the king of Nineveh basically said, we better repent right away. And he got the whole people and sackcloth and said, you got to change your way and so forth and so forth. So there's a medrash that says the king of Nineveh was Pharaoh. It's a few years later, I must admit, and that forget some. It's really, but it was Pharaoh. And when Jonah shows up and says, "Listen, God's not too happy with you. You better repent." Pharaoh's already went through this. I've already been visited by a prophet. I got the message. We're repenting right now, okay? Because Pharaoh understood the message. Now the point is when Pharaoh shows up at Moshe, it's really heaven. Who's your God? I never heard of your God before. And the fact is that in certain ways, Moshe let him along. Moshe basically treated him with respect. He's the king, so he still treated him with respect. Why did Moshe say, let my people go? What was his point? He was going to say, listen, at this point in time, you abide by an ethical system that you own the slaves. So, we're still going to work within your ethical system. Okay? We're going to see when you start understanding that you're wrong. Okay? And that God is God. So we're not going to challenge you right at the beginning. We're not going to sit there and say goodbye and so forth, because that's not an educational process. Pharaoh would have done what any other person would have done. We'd come up with another way of explaining it. Okay, and he would have changed the facts around. But if you do it through this process, it's very clear. And every step of the way, what was Moshe getting across to Pharaoh? So the fact is, Pharaoh had a belief in the social system of the world, including ethical ideas. You can own slaves. Religious ideas. You practice Egyptian religion. Every step of the way, his perceptions were being attacked. Okay? Okay? And the fact is that he was constantly breaking down his a priorities up until the end. And he still held on to certain things. He still said, yeah, but I'm still the king, and I still have a right over the slaves, and so forth and so forth. This is obviously because what was he thinking? Because he was still trying to integrate his perspective with the new perspective. Yeah, this is God, but it's a bigger God. He's a stronger God. Egyptian gods are still around, but he's a stronger God. Okay? So, it's like, okay, so the stronger God's still around. And by the way, people argue that Pharaoh, Moshe was just a bigger a sorcerer at first. The other people of Pharaoh couldn't do the same things. It seems that like the changing of water to blood, other people could do. The Medrash says that the Khartoumim, the Pharaoh did it. So they were able to do other little things. They knew a little bit about the mystical. They knew a little bit about magic. They did this. They did that. Okay, and slowly it was falling apart. But they still said, no, he's a bigger wizard, rather than dropping everything. And then when the Jews took this sheep and said, "This is what we're eating," that really those are our gods. And so try stopping us. Remember, the Jews took the sheep 5 days before, right 4 days before. They took the sheep, on the Shabbos before, Shabbos HaGadol, and they tied it to the doorpost. And the Egyptians were walking around and said, "What do you do with the sheep? It's a holy animal." It's like, think about the cow in India. Well, we're tying it to our place over here, and in a few days we're going to have a roast with it. But it's a sheep. It's holy. Yeah. You want to? It'll be good. It'll be good. And what did they do? They talk about non-enslavement. Okay, but we don't like this, but we're not going to do anything about it because your God is obviously beating up on our God. So in the end, Yul Brynner basically says, he is God. He's basically saying, I got to change my whole way of looking at life. And that's a difficult process. And the truth is, we recognize that within halacha. We talk about individuals and how they were born and the perspectives they have and so forth. It's very interesting within Jewish thought. We are tolerant of understanding that people come with a perspective. So within Jewish thought, we have concepts like the Tinnik Shenishva, of a person who already has varying priorities from the way he was brought up or she was brought up and so forth. We understand, we can't expect them to just drop everything and accept this right away. And we can look at our own perspectives. We look at our own perspectives. How many of our own perspectives we think, everyone must agree upon this, but people don't necessarily agree upon it. And that's really something that happened with the Egyptian point, with the whole aspect of Egypt. What you're reading about is how God, through Moshe Rabbeinu, was trying to get across a point to Pharaoh and the Egyptians of a whole different way of looking at things. And how long did it last? Yeah.
So, why is it important for Pharaoh to change his standpoint? Let's say if the Torah is the history of the Jews and so on. You could have a situation where Pharaoh thinks what he wants to think, and then the Jews leave Egypt and Jewish history and philosophy develops as it does otherwise. Sort of a modern analogy would be, let's say, if you look at Israel, once they signed a peace treaty with Egypt, let's say, it doesn't really matter whether Egyptians have this type of ideology or the other one, as long as they don't bother them.
Well, that's an interesting perspective, because that's where you get the issue of the universal God. Is God only interested in the Jews, or is God interested in the world? Was a perception of to teach Pharaoh? Now, the truth is, there are viewpoints that it was to reinforce who God was to the Jews. The Egyptians weren't going to it wasn't going to last too long with the Egyptians. The fact is that there is another attitude of universal. We want to lay down our effect upon the world. It's something very interesting that we don't recognize in certain ways the different agendas that people face us with, or that exist, and how our agendas work with the rest of the world and so forth. There's it's an interesting shiur on KosherTube by Rabbi Dr. David Katz. And what he deals with is variant agendas, how history is presented, and how people present history pursuant to their agenda, and then someone else might present their history pursuant to another agenda. And, okay, there's a lot to do with who's lying over history in order to present the agenda they want. I used to joke around with Americans about Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold is this great trader, but what should Canadians or United Empire loyalists who left America and came up to Canada and so forth, how would they look upon Benedict Arnold? Right? Shouldn't Benedict Arnold be the great hero of the British? Right? Not the traitor? One guy's traitor is the other guy's hero. Isn't that the way they work? Mm-hmm. So when you say Benedict Arnold, maybe we should be looking at Benedict Arnold in a positive sense. Now, if you actually look in history, the United Empire loyalists did not really like Benedict Arnold. Now, why is that? Because the United Empire loyalists, because Benedict Arnold basically fought for the Americans at first. So at first, he was a revolutionary and so forth. And second of all, he changed his opinion for personal gain. So it wasn't the fact that he saw the light and said, "Oh, I'm now going to be loyal to the monarchy. Okay, I'll get more money this way." So it's very interesting, and I think that's the way I was told it, that the United Empire loyalists, even though Benedict Arnold did come up with the United Empire loyalists to Canada, they didn't like him anymore. But the fact is, if you think about this, one person's traitor is another person's enemy, and then a certain narrative becomes the one that becomes more accepted universally. Like I'm thinking in terms of Joan of Arc. The French, Joan of Arc was a great fighter. To the British, she was real pain in the British side, right? So the point is, but still, Joan of Arc is looked on positively, and this happens even by the British. It's like you don't. There's basically some narrative takes over. Now I'm yeah.
How would you characterize Josephus Flavius?
Interesting figure. There's a tremendous amount of controversy over Josephus in the historical literature, because you were gonna.
Yeah, what I wanted to say is that for very many hundreds of years, Josephus Flavius was seen as a traitor to the Jewish people, until about a few years after the creation of the State of Israel, when people have realized the genius of, at least that's the way I read it, the genius of Josephus Flavius, because if he wouldn't have gone over to the Romans and become Josephus Flavius, there wouldn't have been any historical records of what happened during the time the Roman Empire
Yeah.
Conquered Israel.
That controversy over Josephus is actually mentioned in the literature, in the halachic literature. It didn't just was all black and white to turn at the creation of the state of Israel. You already have disagreements among the commentators of how to look at Josephus' work, because on one hand, see, in the case with Titus, there was a universal, not the case of Titus, with the case of Hadrian and the Battle of Bar Kokhba, there was a universal Jewish antagonism with the Romans. You don't find anything in in Jewish thought that has any type of reconciliation with the Romans of Hadrian. Hadrian is basically seen totally as a bad guy. Vespasian and Titus are very interesting figures. They are still referred to as in the negative. Titus, who destroyed the temple, is still perceived to be an evil person. By definition, the individual who destroys the temple has got to be someone who is evil enough to destroy the temple. But at the same point in time, the relationship with the Romans was not so black and white, because Yochanan ben Zakkai met Vespasian and said, "Give me Yavna," and Vespasian said, "I'll protect the scholars of Yavna." So the fact is that there was some type of the rebellion against Rome in 70 CE. There was tension within the Jewish world over that rebellion. Now we think of Masada and so forth and so forth. Masada was basically the zealots, and they were the zealot population, which basically said we got to fight and go so forth. They were the right wingers. But it's not so simple that the Jews were all right-wingers. And that's where you had Yochanan ben Zakkai making a deal with Vespasian that allowed for the continuation of Jewish scholarship. Josephus was in Vespasian's camp and Titus's camp. But the fact is, it was not so black and white that the Jews should have, and Josephus had that argument. See, what's interesting also is in terms of Rome itself. There were many synagogues in Rome at the time. There wasn't a report that there was plundering of the synagogues in Rome at the time. It was a battle in Israel. From what I remember, and that I think I'm right, is that in terms of Rome, there wasn't so much anti-Semitism in Rome against the Jewish population of Rome. It was a very, very different issue. Now, under Hadrian, it was clearly negative. Clearly negative, the relationship with Rome was totally negative. Okay, none of the rabbis had any, were a reconciliation with Hadrian was not accepted as a substantive rabbinic opinion. In the time of the War of 70 CE, it's not so simple, and that's where you get into issues of Josephus. Was he a traitor? Was he not a traitor? Did he stand for this? Did he stand for that? Did he actually help the Jews in maintaining a certain standard for Jews in the Roman population? So there's a little bit of issues. That actually comes down to how people look at the reading of the books of Josephus. There's some people who say, "Oh, Josephus is a bad guy, you shouldn't read his stuff." Other people say you can read Josephus on Shabbos. It's a halachic issue. Now the fact is what you're getting at is that it shows the complexity of thought. But I want to get back to something about agendas. Okay? As I was developing this stuff from Rabbi Dr. David Katz. You think in terms of agendas and how people perceive things and so forth. So there is no record in Egypt from Egyptian history of the Exodus. The only document we have in support of the Exodus is the Chumash. Okay, there's no independent Egyptian source for the Exodus. Now, there is one contention against that by a guy by the name of Velikovsky. Have you ever heard of Velikovsky? Velikovsky wrote 2 works. He was an interesting thinker. Some people think he was a kook, and other people think he was a genius. He wrote The War of the Worlds and so forth and so forth. In his argument, he contends that there actually are hieroglyphics which could be interpreted as coming from the Exodus and Egyptian statements about the Exodus, but ancient history of Egypt, Egyptology, has dated these hieroglyphics in the 600, 700 BC, and as not being about the Exodus, and they're interpreted differently. So this guy Velikovsky does say, wait a second, if you look at the hieroglyphics a different way and you date them differently, they actually could be about the Exodus. Well, that's to the side, but aside from that, there's no independent thing in Egyptian history. Yet, in 250 BC, an Egyptian priest starts writing an Egyptian narrative on the Exodus. And he starts talking about this population in 250, based upon ancient Egyptian records in 250 BC, about this population that was unclean, and they were revolted against the pharaohs and so forth, but eventually the pharaohs came back, and they kicked this nation out, sent them out to the desert to die of thirst, and the leader of that population was an Egyptian priest who was defrocked or whatever, who then took the name Moses. So according to the Egyptian narrative, the Jews were the bad guys, causing a lot of problems in the Egyptian society. They were unclean and so forth and so forth. And then the Pharaoh was able to kick him out. And the Romans bought into this. Rabbi Dr. Katz mentions that Tacitus, who was a famous Roman historian of the first century, basically takes the Egyptian narrative and so forth. Now, what Rabbi Katz argues, why did the Egyptians get so into this narrative in 250 BC? So what happened that made the Egyptians feel they better come up with another narrative to tell the Exodus story? Because where was the Exodus story written before? It was in the Chumash. And what language was the Chumash? Hebrew. So the Jews read the story, but the general world, they weren't proficient in Hebrew, so no one knew the story. But what happened a little bit before, around this time in history? What happened? The translation of the Bible into Greek. And Greek was the dominant language of the world, of the known world. So all of a sudden, everyone's reading about the Exodus story. And the Exodus story being the story about the poor little Jews who suffered under the Egyptians, and God basically played out his rap against the Egyptians. So this led the Egyptians to say, no, that's not the story. We don't want to look bad. We're going to change the story. And then what happened is the Romans said, listen, we're going to go with the Egyptian story. So Tacitus starts talking about the Jews and not very favorable about them, and they were in Egypt, and they caused problems in Egypt, and they were kicked out of Egypt, and so forth and so forth. And basically they were buying the Egyptian narrative. And then something happened which made the world accept the Jewish narrative and reject the Egyptian narrative. And that was what was happening in the world at this time. People were becoming Christians. And Christians, while they had a lot of Egyptian influence in Christianity, like I didn't notice, the Immaculate Conception was a Egyptian concept and so forth and so forth. But if you're a Christian, you have to adopt the Jewish narrative. So all of a sudden, people were being pushed into the Jewish narrative. Yeah, they made changes. The Jews now weren't so great because they should become Christians and so forth. But the Jewish narrative of the Exodus started being accepted. So it's interesting that Tacitus, as a historian in the first century, before the real emergence of Christianity in the Roman Empire, he was pushing the Egyptian narrative, that the Jews were the bad guys and the Egyptians kicked them out. But the point is that what it really comes down to is we all look at facts the way we want to. We all do this. We all have our bias. We all have our perspective. And the challenge that we face is being able to see the truth and to challenge our a priorities and challenge our starting points and so forth. And that's not easy. And what we see in the Exodus story, in a certain way, is that this is what God wanted to get across to Pharaoh. Okay? And it was a pretty powerful way of getting it across. It's not easy to get people to change their perspective. But it tells you got to have your eyes open. The one interesting thing about this is this is where Judaism really always maintained somewhat of an allegiance to reason. Judaism always talked about svara, about reason. Because the only way people can grow, the only way people are able to reinvestigate what they believe, what they understand, is through being able to discuss and debate. And that can only come about through reason. So Judaism always stressed reason. Yeah, there is an aspect of faith, there's an aspect of intuition, how do you know this? There's an aspect of accepting the history that we've been taught. The reason that we accept the works we have, because I accept, for example, the perception of Chazal because I understand Chazal to be very intelligent and honest individuals. And the fact is do I have certain aspects of faith? Yes. The fact of the matter is that I was brought up as a Jew. So is there aspects of faith? And yes, I am a product of my upbringing, and I am a product of my faith. But the fact is that at every point in time, I have to have aspects of understanding. And therefore, the reason is always an aspect of being Jewish. And that's also why you have to accept tolerance. Because tolerance is an aspect of understanding that we are all subject to our a priorities, we're all subject to how we're brought up, and therefore we can accept challenges, but we also have to understand that there is inherent biases in our perspective. But the point is that I think it's a very important aspect about the Pharaoh story, about the Exodus of Egypt, that really it tells you about the challenge to your perspectives and the openness you have to have, again within reason, right? To thinking. There's always new perspectives, but that doesn't mean the new perspectives are always right either. But there's an aspect of thinking. Okay? Anyways, any questions? Is that okay? Good. Thank you.
Thank you.